Hey everyone, I'm Lauren, 24, and recently married to my high school sweetheart, Chris, who's 25. He's the love of my life, kind, hardworking, and everything I could ever ask for in a partner. Unfortunately, his older brother Nate is the complete opposite. At 27, Nate is the kind of person who leaves a trail of chaos wherever he goes. He's the human equivalent of a thorn in your shoe, painful, irritating, and impossible to ignore. Nate's been a thorn in Chris's life for as long as he can remember. According to Chris, Nate was the golden child growing up, always getting away with everything while Chris took the blame. If Nate broke something, he'd pin it on Chris, and their parents would brush it off with a boys will be boys excuse. As they grew older, the dynamic didn't change. Nate would go out of his way to make Chris feel small, whether it was stealing his friends, mocking his kindness, or making him the butt of every joke. Chris, being the incredible guy he is, always tried to rise above it, but I could see how much it hurt him. Who wouldn't be upset when your own brother treats you like a punching bag? Still, Chris remained kind and kept moving forward, even as Nate continued to live a life of entitlement. Now, let's talk about Nate's train wreck of a life. He's hopped from one dead-end job to another because he can't keep himself accountable. He's the kind of guy who shows up late to work, acts shocked when he gets reprimanded, and then blames everyone else when he gets fired. Despite his mess of a life, their parents still make excuses for him. Nate's just figuring things out, they say, as if being an inconsiderate jerk is something he'll eventually grow out of. When it comes to relationships, Nate's track record is even worse. He's gone through more girlfriends than I can count, and every single one of them eventually realized who he really was: manipulative, controlling, and an expert at gaslighting. For a while, it became almost comical. Nate would bring a new girlfriend to every family gathering, introduce her as the one, and a few months later, she'd disappear as if she never existed. Then, 6 months ago, Nate introduced Stephanie. Stephanie was different, not in a good way though. From the moment she walked into the family barbecue and sized me up with a smirk, I knew she wasn't going to be easy to deal with. "Oh, you're Lauren," she said, looking me up and down. "I thought you'd be taller." Her words were as casual as her tone, but the judgment in her eyes was clear. I laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond, but Chris immediately stepped in. "She's perfect the way she is," he said, giving Stephanie a look that would have made most people back off, but not Stephanie. She just smirked and said, "I was just saying." That set the tone for every interaction I've had with her since. Stephanie had this way of making backhanded comments sound like compliments. To Chris's mom, she said, "You must have been stunning when you were younger. Brad always says you were the prettiest woman in town." She made similar remarks to everyone, planting little seeds of doubt while pretending to be sweet and innocent. Nate, of course, ate it up. He stood by her side, grinning like she was the best thing that ever happened to him. For the first time, it seemed like Nate had found someone who matched his energy. Stephanie was just as self-absorbed and manipulative as he was, and they fed off each other's toxicity. The two of them quickly became the center of every family event, stirring up drama and loving every second of it. But Stephanie wasn't just a mean girl. She was calculated. She studied people, figured out their insecurities, and used them to her advantage. At one family dinner, she complimented Chris by saying, "You must have been such a mama's boy growing up. You're so kind and sensitive." It sounded sweet at first, but Nate jumped on it immediately, laughing and saying, "You don't even know the half of it. He used to cry if Mom didn't cut the crusts off his sandwiches." The whole table laughed, but I saw the discomfort in Chris's eyes. Stephanie just smiled sweetly, like she hadn't just handed Nate the perfect setup to humiliate his brother. Things escalated when Stephanie started planning her wedding with Nate. Yes, they got engaged, and it was as over-the-top as you'd expect. They announced it with a picture of her ring and hashtags like power couple and better than a fairy tale. It was laughably dramatic, but we soon realized it was no coincidence they got engaged shortly after Chris proposed to me. Nate couldn't handle his younger brother being in the spotlight, so he had to one-up him. After they got engaged, Stephanie's wedding planning became her entire personality. Every time we saw her, she'd find a way to bring it up, even if it wasn't relevant. If someone complimented my engagement ring, she'd immediately start talking about her venue or her dress. She wasn't just showing off. She was subtly undermining our plans. One time, she told me, "You'll love wedding planning. It's so stressful but worth it. Just make sure you don't overdo it. Oh, and I'd avoid pastel colors. They're so overdone." I hadn't even mentioned our wedding colors, but I'd been leaning toward pastels. It was clear she was trying to get in my head. Things hit a boiling point at our engagement party. Chris and I planned a small gathering with close friends and family to celebrate, but Nate and Stephanie made it all about them. Stephanie showed up in a glittery dress that screamed, "Look at me," and within minutes, they were working the room, talking about their engagement. But the worst part came halfway through the night. I stepped away to grab some napkins and overheard Nate and Stephanie talking in the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when I heard my name, I couldn't help but stop and listen. Nate was saying, "We need to make sure our wedding is the one everyone remembers. They think they're so perfect, but we'll show them who the real stars of this family are." Stephanie laughed and replied, "Don't worry, babe, I've got a plan. We'll make Lauren think we're on her side, and then, when their wedding comes, we'll hit her where it hurts." My stomach twisted as I kept listening. They weren't just gossiping, they were plotting. Stephanie wanted to befriend my bridesmaids, stir up drama, and ruin my relationships with them. She even planned to give a surprise speech at our reception, pretending it was heartfelt while using it to humiliate me in front of everyone. I felt frozen in place. Who does that? They weren't just trying to upstage us, they wanted to destroy us. That night, after everyone left, I told Chris everything. At first, he didn't want to believe it. "Maybe they were just joking," he said, always trying to see the best in people. But when I repeated their exact words, his face went pale. "They're unbelievable," he muttered. "Why can't they just leave us alone?" We spent hours talking about what to do. Chris wanted to confront them immediately, but I stopped him. I knew Nate and Stephanie would deny everything and twist it around to make us look like the bad guys. That's what they were best at, playing the victim. Instead, I suggested we let them think they were getting away with it. If they wanted to play dirty, we'd play smarter. And so, the plan began. After overhearing Nate and Stephanie's plan to sabotage our wedding, I knew we couldn't sit back and let it happen. But we also couldn't confront them directly. It would just give them more ammunition to twist the story and make us the villains. Instead, Chris and I decided to stay quiet, act polite, and let them think they had the upper hand. Behind the scenes, though, I started laying the groundwork for a plan of my own. If they wanted to mess with our wedding, I was going to make sure their wedding was the one no one forgot, for all the wrong reasons. The first thing I did was start digging into Nate's past. He had a long history of burned bridges and broken relationships, and I figured there were people out there who still had scores to settle. Social media made it surprisingly easy. Within a few days, I'd tracked down several of Nate's ex-girlfriends, and to my surprise, most of them were more than willing to talk. The stories they shared were both shocking and, unfortunately, exactly what I expected. Nate had cheated, lied, and manipulated his way through every relationship. One of his exes, Amy, told me how Nate had been dating her and 2 other women at the same time. "He made me feel like I was crazy for suspecting anything," she said. "I can't believe Stephanie is falling for his act." Another ex, Becca, laughed when I told her what I was planning. "Oh, I'm in," she said. "That guy deserves whatever's coming to him." By the end of the week, I'd assembled a small but determined group of Nate's exes. We started a group chat to share stories and coordinate our efforts. Let me tell you, these women were hilarious. The way they roasted Nate was better than any stand-up routine I'd ever seen. But this wasn't just about venting. We had a mission. Meanwhile, I kept up the facade with Nate and Stephanie. At family gatherings, I smiled and made small talk, even as I felt my blood boil every time they opened their mouths. Stephanie, oblivious as ever, kept up her passive-aggressive digs. "Wedding planning is so stressful," she said one evening, sipping her wine. "But it's worth it. I'm sure your wedding will be sweet. You know, in a simpler kind of way." I just smiled and said, "I'm sure yours will be unforgettable." She had no idea how right I was. As Nate and Stephanie's wedding day approached, everything fell into place. The exes and I had worked out every detail, and when their invitations went out, we knew exactly how to execute the plan. Stephanie's wedding was shaping up to be as over-the-top as you'd expect. They'd booked a lavish venue and invited an extensive guest list, including people from Stephanie's wealthy social circle. It was clear her parents were footing the bill, and Nate, as always, was basking in the attention like he'd earned it. The day of the wedding arrived, and Chris and I attended as dutiful family members, sitting near the back and keeping a low profile. The venue was stunning, decked out with extravagant floral arrangements and chandeliers that screamed, "Look how much money we spent!" Stephanie made her grand entrance in a dress so glittery it was almost blinding, walking down the aisle with a smug smile that said she thought she'd already won. The ceremony started smoothly, at first, but just as they began exchanging vows, Amy stood up from her seat near the back. Dressed in a sleek gown, she looked every bit as polished as the bridal party, and for a moment the guests seemed to think she was part of the ceremony. But when she walked right up to Nate and Stephanie, stopping in front of them, the room went silent. "Nate," Amy said, her voice clear and steady, "before you make any promises today, I think everyone here deserves to know the kind of promises you've broken." Nate's face turned pale, and Stephanie's brow furrowed in confusion. Amy pulled out an envelope and handed it to Nate, who hesitated before Stephanie snatched it out of his hand. She tore it open, pulling out a stack of handwritten letters. "What is this?" Stephanie demanded, flipping through the pages. "They're love letters," Amy explained, her voice calm but cutting. "Letters Nate wrote to me, and to several other women, while he was supposedly committed." The room erupted into whispers as Stephanie's hands shook, her eyes scanning the letters. Before Nate could grab the envelope, another ex, Becca, stood up and strode confidently down the aisle. "Hi, Stephanie," she said sweetly, holding her own envelope. "I'm Becca. I dated Nate for about 6 months. During that time, he told me he was saving up for our future. Turns out, he was borrowing money from me to take other women out on dates." Stephanie's jaw dropped. "Is this true?" she hissed at Nate. "How many of these women are there?" Nate stammered. "It's not what it looks like. They're lying." One by one, more exes stood up. Lisa walked down the aisle with a list of Nate's secret nicknames for his other girlfriends. Danielle held up screenshots of conversations from a dating app, proving Nate had been cheating while living with another woman. Each new revelation left Stephanie more furious and Nate more desperate. The guests were whispering, phones were out recording, and Stephanie's parents looked mortified. Nate's parents, usually so quick to defend him, sat frozen in shock. Stephanie, to her credit, didn't storm off. Instead, she stood there, trembling with rage. "How could you?" she spat at Nate. "Are these women lying? Or is this just a giant coincidence?" Nate's attempts to explain fell flat, and Amy delivered the final blow. "You ruined your own life, Nate," she said. "We're just here to make sure no one else gets hurt." Despite the chaos, Stephanie insisted on continuing the ceremony, though it was clear the damage was done. The reception was a train wreck. Every conversation was about Nate's exes, the letters, and the lies. Guests were openly gossiping, and the newlyweds were left trying to salvage their image. Chris and I stayed just long enough to enjoy the awkwardness before slipping out. On the way home, we laughed until our sides hurt. Nate and Stephanie wanted their wedding to be unforgettable, and in a way, they got their wish, just not the way they'd planned. In the days after Nate and Stephanie's wedding, the drama rippled through their social circles like a boulder dropped in a pond. Everyone was talking about the disaster, from the ex's revelations to Stephanie's visible fury during the ceremony. It was the kind of spectacle people couldn't stop discussing, and for once, Nate and Stephanie's need for attention backfired spectacularly. Chris and I carried on with our lives, trying not to laugh every time we thought about what had happened. We hadn't heard directly from Nate or Stephanie, but the group chats were buzzing with updates. According to mutual friends, Stephanie's parents were furious, not at Nate, which they should have been, but at the embarrassment they'd faced in front of their wealthy friends. Nate's parents, meanwhile, were uncharacteristically quiet, seemingly unsure how to handle their golden child's spectacular fall from grace. A few days after the wedding, Stephanie started posting passive-aggressive comments on social media about fake people and how she'd never let anyone ruin her happiness. Nate, predictably, wasn't subtle. He posted a long rant claiming jealous, bitter women had tried to sabotage his wedding, but failed because, as he put it, love always wins. The comments section was a mix of clueless friends supporting him and others hinting that maybe he wasn't as innocent as he claimed. Chris and I kept our heads down, liking a few neutral posts here and there to avoid suspicion. But then, Nate and Stephanie started sniffing around. It began with a random phone call from Nate. Chris was in the kitchen making dinner when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, sighed, and put it on speaker. "So," Nate said, dragging the word out awkwardly, "how'd you guys enjoy the wedding?" Chris gave me a look but kept his tone light. "It was nice. The venue was beautiful." "Yeah, thanks," Nate replied, his voice shifting to something more guarded. "You guys didn't notice anything weird, did you? Like during the ceremony?" Chris didn't miss a beat. "Weird? No, why?" "Oh, nothing," Nate said quickly, letting out a forced laugh. "Just thought you might have heard some rumors or something. You know how people can be. Jealous, bitter, whatever." I bit my lip to keep from laughing. Chris stayed calm. "Didn't hear anything," he said casually. "Everything seemed fine to me." Yeah, that's what I thought too," Nate said, his words coming out too fast. "Anyway, see you around." He hung up before Chris could respond, and as soon as the call ended, we burst out laughing. But Nate wasn't the only one fishing for answers. Over the next few days, Stephanie started asking other family members if they knew anything about the exes showing up. Word got back to us through Chris's sister, Emma, who called to update us. "They're convinced someone set them up," she said, barely able to contain her laughter. "Stephanie thinks it was one of her bridesmaids, but Nate is convinced it was you two." "Let them think that," Chris said with a smirk. "They can't prove anything." For a while it felt like we were in the clear, but then Chris's parents invited us over for dinner, and we knew something was up. His parents had always tried to stay neutral in the sibling drama, but the tension in the air when we walked into their house was palpable. Normally, Chris's mom would be chatting about her garden or her favorite Netflix show, but that night, she barely said a word. His dad, always quick with a joke, was unusually quiet. After dinner, Chris's mom cleared her throat. "We've been hearing some things about Nate's wedding," she said, her voice cautious. "Apparently, some women showed up during the ceremony and Nate and Stephanie think, well, they think someone set it up." Chris played dumb. "Oh, what kind of things?" His mom sighed. "They think it might have been you two." Chris tensed beside me, but I decided to take the lead. "Why would they think that?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "We didn't have anything to do with it." His dad frowned. "Well, you have to admit it's a little suspicious. Those women showing up, it's not the kind of thing that just happens. And you've never exactly gotten along with Nate." Chris exhaled, leaning forward. "All right, fine, it was us." His mom gasped, and his dad stared at him, jaw tightening. "You're serious?" his dad asked. "Yes," I said firmly. "We planned it. But before you get mad, you need to know why." We explained everything. How I'd overheard Nate and Stephanie plotting to humiliate us at our wedding. How they'd planned to ruin my relationships with my bridesmaids and turn our reception into a spectacle. I told them about the awful things they'd said, the way they laughed about it like it was some big joke. Chris added, "We didn't want to do this, but they left us no choice. They've been trying to tear us down for years. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting ourselves." Chris's mom looked horrified. Not at us, but at the idea that Nate and Stephanie could be so cruel. "Are you sure they were really planning all that?" she asked. "I heard them say it," I replied. "Every word. They didn't care how much it would hurt us. They just wanted to make our wedding a joke." His dad rubbed his temples, clearly trying to process everything. "You shouldn't have stooped to their level," he finally said. "But I can't say I blame you." His mom nodded slowly. "It's hard to hear, but if what you're saying is true, I understand why you did it. I just wish things hadn't come to this." The conversation ended on a tense but understanding note. They didn't condone what we did, but they couldn't deny that Nate and Stephanie had pushed us to the edge. When we left their house, I felt lighter, knowing we wouldn't face backlash from his parents. But I also knew the drama wasn't over. Nate and Stephanie wouldn't let this go quietly. After the tense dinner with Chris's parents, I thought we'd finally reached a turning point. They weren't thrilled with what we'd done, but they understood why we felt pushed to take action. Chris and I hoped that would be the end of it. Unfortunately, Nate and Stephanie weren't the kind of people to let things go. A few days later, Chris got a strange call from an old coworker he hadn't spoken to in years. The guy congratulated Chris on our wedding and said, "I'm looking forward to seeing you both there." Chris, confused, asked what he meant. It turned out that Nate and Stephanie had somehow gotten hold of our guest list and sent out fake invitations under other people's names. At first, we didn't even believe it. Who does that? But as more people started reaching out about duplicate RSVPs with slightly different details, it became clear Nate and Stephanie were behind it. Their plan was obvious: sneak into our wedding under fake names, cause a scene, and ruin our day. Thankfully, Chris and I had anticipated something like this. After their wedding fiasco, we'd taken every precaution to protect our own. We hired security for the venue and required all guests to check in with ID at the door. At first, it felt like overkill, but now we were grateful we'd gone the extra mile. On the day of our wedding, everything started perfectly. The weather was beautiful, our closest friends and family were arriving, and Chris and I were giddy with excitement. As the guests filed into the venue, security did their job seamlessly, checking names and IDs against the official guest list. Then it happened. Our wedding planner rushed over to me, her face pale. "We have a situation at the entrance," she said. "There's a couple trying to get in, claiming to be family." My stomach dropped. "Is it Nate and Stephanie?" I asked. She nodded. "What do you want us to do?" Chris and I had already agreed on how to handle this. "Stick to the plan," I told her. "Just make sure they don't get in. We're not dealing with them today." At the entrance, Nate was in full performance mode, dressed in a sharp suit and trying to charm his way past the security team. "This is family business," he argued, his voice growing louder with every word. "You can't keep me out of my own brother's wedding." Stephanie stood beside him, arms crossed and looking furious. "We're on the guest list," she snapped. "This is ridiculous." The head of security, a no-nonsense man we'd hired specifically for situations like this, didn't budge. "Your names aren't on the list," he said firmly. "Without an invitation or proper identification, I can't let you in." Nate's face turned red as he launched into a rant about how family doesn't need an invitation. Stephanie, meanwhile, completely lost her cool. "This isn't over," she screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the security guard. "You'll regret this." The guard remained calm and escorted them back to their car, ignoring their threats and protests. By the time they finally drove off, half the guests were already inside, completely unaware of the drama unfolding outside. Chris and I stayed focused on each other, determined not to let Nate and Stephanie ruin our day, and they didn't. The ceremony was everything we'd dreamed of. Beautiful, emotional, and full of love. Surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us, Chris and I celebrated the life we were building together. Standing at the altar, holding his hands, I realized nothing else mattered. We had each other, and that was enough. The reception was just as perfect. The food was delicious. The music kept everyone dancing, and the atmosphere was full of joy. Our friends and family showered us with love and support, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely free of Nate and Stephanie's negativity. But of course, word got out about what had happened at the entrance. Some guests had seen Nate and Stephanie being turned away and wasted no time sharing the details. The story spread fast, and people couldn't get enough of it. While we celebrated, Nate and Stephanie became the butt of the joke in their own social circles. Their reaction was predictable. Nate posted a rant on social media about being excluded from family events and how Chris had betrayed his own blood. Stephanie, meanwhile, went silent on Instagram for weeks, an unthinkable move for someone who thrived on attention. Mutual friends told us she was furious about how everything had played out, especially after her parents expressed their disappointment in her behavior. Then, about a month after our wedding, we heard the news. Stephanie had finally had enough. She dug deeper into Nate's past and uncovered just how much he'd lied to her, not just about his finances, but about his relationships, his job history, and even his role in planning their own wedding. Apparently, the blowout fight that followed was nothing short of legendary. Stephanie packed her things and left him, moving back in with her parents while Nate scrambled to figure out what to do next. For the first time, Nate was facing real consequences, and there was no one left to clean up his mess. He tried calling Stephanie, messaging her, even showing up at her parents' house, but she was done. As far as we know, they haven't spoken since. As for Chris and me, we're happier than ever. Our wedding was everything we'd hoped for, and we've spent the months since enjoying married life without Nate and Stephanie's drama weighing us down. Cutting them out of our lives was the best decision we ever made. Sometimes, poetic justice comes in the form of standing up for yourself and refusing to let toxic people dictate your happiness. To anyone dealing with similar family drama, you don't have to accept disrespect just because it comes from someone you share blood with. You deserve better. And walking away, that's not giving up, it's choosing yourself. Story 2, 23. That's how old I am now, finally free from the digital cage my parents built around us. See, I grew up in a family that decided to live their lives online. Not just any online life, mind you. We were family vloggers. It started innocently enough. Back in 2013, my parents posted a random video of my little brother doing something silly, and it blew up. Millions of views. And just like that, they were hooked. I was 12 at the time. Shy, introverted. Definitely not the type who wanted to be in front of a camera 24/7. But my parents didn't care. They were blinded by the views, the subscribers, the attention. My brother, on the other hand, loved it. He was the star of the show. Loud, goofy, always craving the spotlight. But soon, that wasn't enough. They wanted more. More views, more content, more of us. The vlogging became a full-time job. Daily uploads, staged family moments, fake smiles. We were living in a fishbowl. Every aspect of our lives on display for the world to see. And the world was watching. Mostly grown men, I realized later. Men who had no business watching a family, especially not the kind of stuff my parents were putting out there. They filmed everything. My first period, getting my first bra, even getting braces. Nothing was sacred. I felt uncomfortable, exposed, but I was a kid. What could I do? My parents brushed off my concerns. We're just sharing our family's journey, they'd say. But it wasn't a journey. It was a performance, and we were the unwilling actors. We went from a few thousand subscribers to millions. People started recognizing us in public. It was surreal, unsettling. I tried talking to my parents about how I felt, about the lack of privacy, the constant pressure to perform, but they didn't listen. We're doing this for the family, they'd say, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like exploitation, like we were commodities, not their children. The worst part was the facade. The perfect family they presented to the world was a lie. Behind the scenes, my parents were constantly arguing. The house was filled with tension, not laughter. I started to resent the camera, the viewers, the whole charade. I withdrew, trying to disappear into the background. But my parents didn't care. As long as I was in the shot, they were happy. Looking back, I wish I'd fought harder. But I was just a kid. I trusted my parents. I thought they knew best. I was wrong. The vlogging life wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, that's for sure. Behind the perfectly curated videos and happy family facade, things were falling apart. My parents' marriage was imploding. The pressure of maintaining this perfect image, the constant need for content, the obsession with views and money, it all took a toll. The fights started small, but they escalated quickly. I'd lie in bed at night, listening to their muffled shouts, the slamming doors, the heavy silence that followed. Then came the betrayal. My dad, the patriarch of our happy family, was cheating on my mom. And not with just anyone. He was having an affair with another family vlogger, someone we'd collaborated with, someone who'd sat in our living room, shared meals with us, pretended to be our friend. I stumbled upon the evidence by accident. Emails on my dad's laptop, filled with sickeningly sweet nothings and plans for their next rendezvous. My stomach churned. I felt sick, but I kept quiet. I was too scared to tell my mom to face the fallout. But secrets have a way of surfacing. A few months later, the truth came out. The screaming match that ensued was something out of a horror movie. My mom was devastated. My dad was scrambling to deny it all, and we kids were caught in the crossfire. And yet, the vlogs continued. We'd go from a screaming match to filming a fun family game night in the blink of an eye. It was surreal, disturbing. My dad eventually left, packed his bags and walked out, leaving a gaping hole in our lives and a thick layer of tension hanging in the air. But the show must go on, right? My mom, desperate to hold on to what was left of our family, our income, our identity, doubled down on the vlogging. We were still going on family outings, still doing fun challenges, still pretending everything was okay. It wasn't. The money started drying up. My dad had been the one handling the business side of things, and without him, the sponsorships dwindled. The views plateaued. My mom panicked. I hated it. Hated the fake smiles, the staged moments, the lies. I tried to avoid the camera, but my mom wouldn't let me. "We need you," she'd say. "This is all we have left." I felt trapped, suffocated, like I was drowning in a sea of pretense. The rest of the family was struggling too. My younger siblings were confused, angry. My mom, lost in her grief and desperation, was barely present. We were a family in name only, held together by the thin thread of our online persona. One night, I broke down. Years of pent-up frustration, sadness, and anger came pouring out. I told my mom everything, how I hated the vlogs, the fake life, the constant pressure to perform. She cried, said she never meant for things to get this bad, but it was too late. The damage was done. We kept vlogging. The charade continued. But I knew I couldn't stay. I was just waiting for my escape. 18. Graduation day. My ticket to freedom. I packed my bags, said a hasty goodbye, and walked out the door without looking back. My mom didn't fight me. I think she knew it was coming. Maybe she was even relieved. One less actor in her crumbling production. I crashed with a friend, got a part-time job, started taking classes at a community college. It was a struggle, adjusting to a life outside the vlogging bubble. I felt like a fish out of water, awkward and unsure, but it was real, and that's what mattered. The internet, however, had a long memory. People still recognized me. "Hey, aren't you from that family vlog?" they'd ask, their eyes lighting up with recognition. I'd force a smile, but inside, I cringed. I was still that girl from the YouTube videos, not a real person with a real life. The messages started coming. Strangers asking why I wasn't in the videos anymore. Creepy guys saying they missed seeing me. I deleted my social media accounts, cutting off the last vestiges of that online life. My mom never reached out. Not a single call, text, or email. It hurt at first, but then I realized it was for the best. We had nothing left to say. The bridge was burned. I tried to stay in touch with my siblings, but it was hard. They were still trapped in that house, still performing for the camera. My mom kept them busy, distracted. I felt like I was losing them too. One day, I went back for a visit. A foolish hope bloomed in my chest. Maybe things had changed. Maybe my mom had realized her mistakes. They hadn't. The house was the same. Cameras everywhere. My mom greeted me with that same fake smile, the one reserved for the viewers. She wanted me back in the videos, said the fans were asking about me, that it would be good for the channel. I couldn't believe it. After everything, all she cared about was the content. I told her no, that I was moving on, building a life for myself outside the vlogging world. She didn't take it well, accused me of being selfish, of abandoning the family. "It's not about the channel," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "It's about the fact that you used us. You turned our lives into a commodity." I left that day and haven't been back. It's hard not being part of their lives, but I'm finally free. Free from the camera, the pressure, the lies. I'm figuring out who I am, what I want. It's not easy, but it's real. And that's all I ever wanted. The scars of my vlogging childhood remain. The anxiety, the distrust, the fear of being watched. But I'm healing, slowly but surely. I'm building a life for myself, a life that's truly mine. A life where I can finally be myself, without a camera lens distorting my reality. And that, I realize, is the greatest freedom of all.